Thank you very much, and thank you for your welcome. Can you hear me okay if I'm standing like this? Okay, thank you. I hadn't realised your last speaker was Clive Waddington. I was an undergraduate with him at Newcastle, but those stories we'll save for another occasion. I'll wait for this to warm up. I'm afraid I kind of tend to start my lectures these days with a slight aside as to why I think people invite me to give lectures, so I will do that before I actually get into the main meat of the lecture proper when it starts up. Yes, thank you. The title, I hope the title doesn't need much explanation. I won't read this out. I mean, it's one of these things that this statement got a lot of ridicule when it first came out, but actually when you start applying it to archaeology, it's actually really quite good. Because I actually felt that the area I work in, yes, there are known knowns, but I work in a lot of known unknowns, really. And as for the unknowns, well, it's lovely when surprises happen, really, isn't it? The reason I think I've been asked to talk to you this evening is 20 years ago now, this seminal work came out, Roman Camps in England, which I think was a project that had been running for the best part of 25 years and contained some of the most wonderful maps and plans of Roman camps. And that partly inspired me to undertake the research that I did, which was firstly together with Jeff Davis of the University of Wales in Aberystwyth on Roman camps in Wales and the Marches, but also then to continue my studies in Scotland. And I did a PhD with Professor Bill Hanson in Glasgow on Roman camps some years ago, which was published as this book by the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland a few years ago. And then I did a sort of shorter synthesis, which came out 3 years ago by Amberley Publications, which is, and I will kind of confess now that the majority of my talk, even though it's Roman camps in Britain, is actually Wales and Scotland with a few English examples thrown in. And in fact, it's mostly Scotland, because as you hear, I work there, I study there, and I will explain to you why it's more interesting as well. So apologies for that. My slight aside is that when my books came out, my work, I was working at the Commission at the time, did a wonderful sort of PR job, which actually led to the book selling out within a year because they did such a good job on the PR. Some of the PR made me realise, don't believe everything you read. I don't challenge the myth that Scotland was never conquered by the Romans. And there was a whole load of other wonderful things that came through. This is one of my favourite ones because he's one of my favourite actors and my name's underneath him. Not that I'm ever going to meet him. And another one, I had a member of the press contact me and say, will you talk about this camp of Kintor? And, for our readers, how many football pitches can you fit into it? At which point I was like, I'll go away and look up the size of a football pitch, at which point I found out there isn't a standard size for a football pitch. So researching Roman camps, you never know what you're going to learn. Although in that instance, it was roughly 60, so I was at least able to give them something for their readers. But anyway, moving on to what I'm going to talk about this evening, this is basically the brief overview, what's a camp, quick review of the Roman conquest of Britain and how we know what we know, which is effectively the meat of the lecture, and then I'll finish up with how that sort of affects our understanding of the chronology and context. So I'll start with what I mean by a camp. And I think it's fair to say that, there's lots of sort of different language that's used, and as soon as you start working in an international environment, people start using different language in different countries. But what we are effectively saying that camps are temporary things. They're not permanent. They're not forts. And so I think that distinction is quite helpful in that they're only ever intended for some kind of temporary purpose. And in terms of the classical sources don't give us the distinction that we tend to like to use as archaeologists. We like putting classifications on things to help us to kind of pocket them and manage them and interpret them and explain them. And the classical sources just use things like castra and these different castra, Eistever, Hiberna, and Stativer. And as I say, what a camp isn't is a permanent installation, and these are some of the standard permanent installations that you'll get. So if you wanted to hear a talk about Roman forts, apologies, that's not what I'm talking about this evening. Now, in terms of what camps are, we tend to divide them up into 4 different types. The bulk of the ones that we have in Britain are interpreted as marching or campaign camps, so the bulk of tonight's lecture will be talking about those, but I'll also touch on the other ones. And a marching camp, which also is sometimes called campaign camps, is basically an enclosure that housed troops who are away from their base. Now, whether that's on policing or on campaign, but basically it's an army force. And I will be showing you lots and lots of plans and empty fields. So I thought I'd at least start the lecture with this is, if you walked into a camp 2,000 years ago, this is what you would have expected to do. I'm not going to conjure up the smells for you, I'm pleased to say, but at least it gives you a very, very good picture of rows upon rows of tents. We're not talking permanent buildings, we're talking soldiers that are travelling through the landscape, sometimes in extremely large forces, particularly when you start getting into Scotland. Camps are laid out in a similar way to civilian structures, so we think that they were laid out with a groma, like this example here. And in terms of that's I'll come back to marching camps more, but moving on to another different category, practice camps. Now, practice camps, quite a lot of them may have been used for training and manoeuvres. Some of them are actually far too small to have even actually held troops. The best examples of practice camps are actually in parts of upland Wales, and I think parts of Wales can probably be quite best described as a sort of a classical equivalent of Salisbury Plain. And this example here, there's on the top right image, there's 5 camps. I'm sorry, it's never that easy to actually show them, but hopefully on the image below, there's a Roman fort here at Tomonamere in Snowdonia, and here's the Roman road coming out here, and it's quite clear that they made the soldiers sort of enjoy, in effect, a brisk march away from the base and then practice constructing these camps. And they show a marked concentration in corners, in gate entrance types, and this one at Rhythi, which is one of the ones, I say, near Tomonamere. You couldn't actually put a Roman tent in the middle of it, so it was clearly never intended for occupation, and they are clearly practicing. And it's quite possible that it was a period of time when they had new recruits that they were training up, and a lot of them occur within a day's march down a Roman road from an auxiliary fort at a time potentially in the 1st century AD when there may have been an influx of new recruits. That's one of the theories that we've got behind it. The next one area is a siege camp. Now, siege camps are very well documented throughout the empire, but not really so well in Britain. So there's different types of siege camps that you can get. And as I say, they're best known on the continent. And the ones here on the plan on the right here, around Numantia in Spain from the 130s BC, very well documented in the literature. This is Masada from the Jewish wars of the 70s. And in fact, this at the top is a siege ramp. And to give you an idea of scale, that is Fraser Hunter. And if in the unlikely event I'm ever in a desert with him again, I'll tell him to wear something other than yellow. But at least it gives you an idea of the scale of these things. And in these instances, they're also circumvallations surrounding whatever settlement site that they happen to be besieging. The best claimed examples that we have in Britain are these two on either side of the hill at Burnswalk in Dumfriesshire. Now, there has been more debate about this hill than any other hill I can think of in Scotland over the last 40, 50 years as to whether it was a siege, whether it was a practice siege, a genuine siege. Lots and lots of papers and things have been written about it. But there is actually a project between people in Dumfries and Galloway and the Tremontium Trust over in the Scottish borders at the moment, which is taking quite an innovative approach to metal detecting to try and ascertain whether there were genuine, because there have been various lead sling bullets found on the hill, and whether these were actually fired in anger or in practice. And although it's still the early days of that project, because they've been digging for 2 of the last 3 years, or are undertaking various surveys, they're starting to err on the side that they think it possibly was a siege. So that's a site where debate is still very much ongoing, but research is also ongoing, which might actually start to push this discussion further forward. And the last category, which I'll touch on briefly, is construction camps. Now, it's quite difficult to actually differentiate when you've got a construction camp, because as I will explain shortly, determining function of these things is not necessarily straightforward. But what we can do is actually start to sort of say, well, why do we think a site might be a construction camp? And in fact, the best examples are from, you guessed it, Scotland. And in fact, they're along the line of the Antonine Wall. There isn't such a discrete set along Hadrian's Wall that cluster together and that group. And Hadrian's Wall obviously saw much, much more activity over multiple centuries than the Antonine Wall did. But we have a suite of camps. Some of them have actually got similarities in size, and there's 4 larger ones at the bottom. 2 of them have been excavated and produced late Hadrianic, early Antonine pottery, so something that can comfortably date it. All have been recorded purely as crop marks from the air. So hopefully you'll see this one here, which is just near the Falkirk Wheel in central Scotland. And so they've all been recorded since the 1940s. And this is the location of them. So you'll find that the rectangles are the Roman forts along the Antonine Wall, and they tend to cluster sometimes in pairs. And there's been suggestions that, I mean, we've lost some, but then you've got Glasgow and various things sitting over this area here. So we are conscious that the Antonine Wall runs through the most densely populated part of Scotland, which does actually affect the amount of knowledge we've been able to ascertain about some of these structures. But some of them, as I say, are in pairs, and so they may have been work gangs that were involved in construction of the ditch and the rampart, for example. Another site that's been claimed as being a construction camp with really quite good validity is this one at Steed Stalls, which is near the 1st century fortress of Inchtuthil in Perthshire, where you've got the camp you can see coming round here. It's only about 3 miles away down a Roman road, and it's got these farmy tadpole-like things here, which are then upstanding here, and we think they're quite possibly lime kilns. No one's excavated them, and these are the sort of the stalls that have given the site its name. And to give you an example of what a Roman military lime kiln might look like, here's an example from one in Bulgaria, just to give you an idea of what we might be dealing with here. And so they may well have been involved in the construction of the fortress. In terms of classical sources, we've got a handful of military manuals. Here's one by Vegetius, which is a late 4th, early 5th century manual. And this is the wonderful quote about a walled city, the soldiers carrying this city around with them. Josephus, writing in the Jewish War of the 1st century AD, refusing battle till they fortified their camp, the army with engineers building. One of the more interesting statements around all of this is they fire the camp, which they can easily reconstruct if required. Well, that may have been standard practice in 1st century Judea, but if they were actually firing the camp routinely in Britain, I don't think we'd have had the scale of survival that we have, and particularly in upland areas. So that may not have been something that they did as a standard practice everywhere. We've also got Trajan's Column, Trajan's Wars with the Dacians in Romania, also providing a wonderful source of the army on the move, campaign and camps. And I particularly like this one. You've got the tents and standards and everything actually operating inside the camp. And then actually we've got another handful of sources. The first detailed study is Polybius, who was a Greek writing in the 2nd century BC. And there are some similarities between what he wrote and some of the sort of broadly contemporary sites that we have in the Republican period in Spain. And then later on, into the probably into the early 2nd century AD, although the date is disputed, we've got Hyginus writing about what may have been a hypothetical army, but again it provides us with a bit of information about how we might interpret these things, how they might have operated. Putting that into a Scottish context, this is the largest camp recorded in Britain, in Europe, until about 4 years ago, in the world. And then they found larger ones in Syria, because obviously, understandably, they stopped doing fieldwork in Syria and started looking at air photographs. So a colleague has actually found some that are bigger than this. This is 170 acres in size, to give you an idea of scale. And so this is absolutely vast, and this is in the Scottish borders. This is the smallest one, Llynnoraethllyn 4. If I hadn't used a thick pen, you wouldn't see it. To give you an idea of scale, that is 200 metres squared. It's tiny. It's one of the little ones that's in Snowdonia that I mentioned earlier. In terms of where we actually have camps, we're very, very fortunate that we've got such a wonderful plethora in Britain. But actually there's been some wonderful research in recent years in the Lower Rhine in Germany, particularly using laser scanning from the air, finding all kinds of new camps. And in fact, the area that's closest to northern Britain is actually the Czech Republic and Slovakia, where you've got campaigns beyond the frontier. and they've been mounting a particularly strong research programme. Since they started aerial survey, they've all been found from the air since, in effect, 1990, when they actually started aerial reconnaissance in those countries. And they've been doing a wonderful research project there. But they are also known from the east and through Egypt. These areas haven't been quite so well studied, but we have actually got some examples in Romania and Hungary. We have gotten the length and breadth of the Roman Empire. So I'll give a very, very quick overview of the Roman conquest of Britain, and in terms of what that means for the archaeology. This slide always goes down well in Scotland, as you can imagine, because more than half of the camps in Britain are in Scotland, which, as I say, is why I'm going to give you a Scottish bias. But we also have, as I say, there's 18% of all camps in Britain have been found in Wales. So that is a distribution map of camps across Britain. There have been one or two discovered down here and other places in recent years, particularly through excavation, which is interesting that's one mechanism whereby we're getting more discovery. And as you'll see here, that the Welsh is dominated by these practice camps. In terms of the conquest, the majority, as I've said, are in the north and west of Britain, as you saw from the previous slide. And there is a lack of knowledge of camps in southern England, but it may be because these were areas that were quite quick to conquer, and the form of defence that they may have used for the camps may not necessarily have always constructed a ditch around the perimeter. And if you haven't necessarily got a ditch around the perimeter, then it's not necessarily going to be that easy to trace unless there's internal structures which have survived. And we are also, of course, over here dealing with the a very dense period of development and settlement in the intervening couple of millennia. Moving on to Wales, the areas, I'd say, where we get lots of camps are areas quite often which were difficult to conquer, and that there were repeated attempts. And Wales is one example of this, where it did take them a bit of time to conquer Wales. And as we've got hints of army activities, and here you've got an example of what the conquest of Britain looked like in the first few decades. And then moving on to the conquest of northern England again, which took a little bit of time to conquer. And then when we move up to Scotland, we've then got an area where there were repeated attempts on the line beyond Hadrian's Wall, and Scotland was never really fully held. So in terms of how we know what we know, I say that was very much a brief overview. We've been extremely fortunate in Britain that we have a long history of antiquarian research, very apt to say that, standing in the Society of Antiquaries of London. One of my own personal heroes, Robert Melville, who was a military man of the 18th century, who actually did an awful lot of work but passed it on to other people to publish, by and large. So there's lots of his work in lots of 18th century books. The person he regarded as his young proselyte, although I don't know why he recalled him that when he was only 3 years younger than him, was William Roy, who is known to many as the person who agitated and eventually led to the foundation of the Ordnance Survey. And he mapped a whole series of sites that were discovered by Robert Melville, and there was one particular year in the summer of 1754 rather, Robert Melville went out on his horse and in a period of 5 days discovered 4 camps in Angus, slightly given away with clues that one of them's called battle dykes, one of them's called war dykes. So there's sort of place name evidence that was indicative, but he was the person that interpreted them as temporary camps, and he was the person that explained to William Roy what the difference was between a camp and a fort. And Roy went along the following year in 1755 and planned these camps, and quite a few of them are no longer visible on the ground. So we have these wonderful mid-18th century drawings of sites that have been obliterated in effect by the plough, only to be visible as crop marks from the air. And when we've taken some of these plans and scanned them and put them into a computer and overlain them with modern maps, they are incredibly accurate, which I think just demonstrates the map-making ability of William Roy, even at what was really quite a young age. In tandem with this, we have Henry McLaughlin's work from the mid-19th century, who was commissioned by the Duke of Northumberland to do work in the Hadrian's Wall area, also recording quite a large number of the camps that lie in that vicinity. And then there's this wonderful piece of work by the Reverend Thomas Price, described, I think, in the article in the Welsh literature as a zealous antiquary. Another young man who actually, there was an expansion of the Victorian spa town of Clanrindod Wells, and he was then recording some of the sites, some of which have been gone and more have been found since. And there are now 21 practice camps known on Llandrindod Common, which is the area immediately south of Llandrindod Wells, just down from the Roman fort at Castell Cochlan. So again, we're very much indebted to our predecessors. And one of the predecessors that really helped move the discipline forward was O.G.S. Crawford, who was appointed archaeological officer for the Ordnance Survey, the first one in 1920. And he's got some wonderful writings of his flights in a puss moth. His first flight across in northern Britain and Scotland was in 1930, and he was sort of wondrous things that he saw, but didn't take a camera with him. And he next did the same flight in 1939, did take a camera with him, and there were so numerous things he focused on the Romans. So good for people like me, not so good for the people studying the other periods. But the other thing we can thank Crawford for was he did the first edition of the Ordnance Survey map of Roman Britain, which started their period mapping series, and that's now in its 6th edition, so that still stood the test of time because of the popular interest in the Romans. This isn't a photograph he took, but this is one of the sites, the camps that he took in Galway and Dumfries and Galloway on that 1939 flight. I've got a copy of the photograph that he took, but it doesn't reproduce well because, as you can imagine, it's of an age now. But his legacy was then very much picked up by Kenneth St. Joseph, who was in the RAF in the Second World War and then employed by Cambridge University from 1948 onwards. And he was the person that really developed and pushed forward the subject, another Roman archaeologist. And then in northern Britain, we were very fortunate that Gordon Maxwell, another Romanist working for the Royal Commission, set up the flying programme in 1976 in Scotland, and that programme is still going well today. And the kind of aerial survey that we're talking about is literally flap up the wing of your Cessna and stick a camera out. And I did take this photograph, but I will point out I was lying on the tarmac at Edinburgh Airport at the time. In terms of the rates of discovery, we've got the wonderful antiquarian sources discovering all those wonderful sites in the 18th century. The 19th century, there was a massive bonus in discovery from the work of the Ordnance Survey in the first edition mapping survey. And then you will see the explosion of knowledge from the 40s onwards that's come from aerial survey across Britain. And if I extended this into the 2010s, there'd be a couple of slight blips, but there has been a notable drop-off to a certain extent because of the scale of aerial survey that there's been in these areas. And in terms of the ones that we know across Britain, over 60% of camps across Britain have been recorded from aerial survey. One interesting I quite often do lectures on Roman camps in Scotland, and it's quite interesting to see the difference between Britain and Scotland, in that 82% of camps in Scotland have been recorded by aerial survey. So it had an even bigger impact in Scotland than it had in the rest of Britain. Now, St. Joseph spent his summers flying and then his Septembers digging trenches through to verify that these things were camps. And at one point I worked out that over half of all the camps recorded north of Hadrian's Wall have had a trench through them by St. Joseph at some point in sort of 40, 50 years of digging. So these are the camps north of the Antonine Wall, and every one with a cross on it is one that St. Joseph stuck a trench through. So it gives you an idea of the scale of the work. We've got his notebooks in Edinburgh, and these wonderful references to young Maxwell, who's been retired for 20 years. 20 years now. Yeah, he retired in '95. As I say, he's one of the other pioneers in Scotland, and he did quite a lot of excavations with St. Joseph. Interestingly, one of the sites St. Joseph didn't stick a hole through is Kintore, and that's one I will talk about shortly, because it's one that's actually pushed forward our knowledge, I think, more than any other site across Britain. So I think he missed a trick by not digging that one. Kintore is in the commuter belt for Aberdeen, which, as you can imagine, the expansion of Aberdeen since in effectively the oil boom years led to lots and lots of housing estates being built. And there had been a perception up until this point that camps mostly, they were barren in their interior. They were just ditches, and then you just had tents inside and nothing came out of the interior. And so far, 180 ovens and a whole series of pits have been recorded coming out of these things, giving us a wealth of information about the army on the march, and really actually giving us an indication about how frugal the army was, because there aren't lots and lots of finds. Some of these ovens have demonstrated sort of up to 5 or 6 firings. Now, on the assumption that these firings may have taken any place anywhere between daily and weekly, we can say that these sites may have been occupied for potentially between a week to 6 weeks at a time. So the previous theory that they only occupied them for a night and moved on, but if that was the case, they'd have got up to northern Scotland very quickly. So there must have been a longer length of time. And when you're talking about a large army, there's a whole range of things around supplies and how you actually then furnish that army. I'll also just highlight a site in Wales where we've got an interesting sort of example from aerial survey, where in some instances the perimeter defence has continued. There is no, if you see there, in some photographs there's a break, and in some photos there isn't a break. And when some of these sites have been excavated, they've shown an additional defence feature across the ditch, which I'll come back to. I just wanted to give you a Welsh example, so I wasn't just giving you Scottish ones. But there's an additional defence feature in here, which demonstrates that these sites were used more than once. So although Kintore is showing multiple firings, we're not necessarily suggesting that it was repeatedly reused, because the radiocarbon dates are all showing a discrete period of use in the late 1st century for that particular site in Kintore, which is when we would expect. Now that moves us on to the survival of camps and their distribution. Now, about 1/3 of camps across Britain have had some form of surviving earthwork component. Now this is particularly marked in Wales, where we must have lost huge numbers in lowland areas, particularly in lowland pasture areas, which aren't necessarily responsive to aerial survey and the techniques that we're using to recover them. But as you can see here, 73% of sites in Wales, this is, as I say, boosted very much by the practice camps that you get in upland areas, and they cluster down in southern Wales and in northern Wales. In Scotland, you will see the vast majority are crop marks. 83% of sites in Scotland are crop marks. Now, some of the sites up here are extremely large. They're some of the largest anywhere in the empire. And you might find you've got an enormous camp with, in effect, kilometres of ditch, and there's a 30-metre stretch in woodland where you've actually got a slight surviving thing, which no one would ever have interpreted as Roman had we not found the rest of the camp coming round as a crop mark. So when I say 83% of crop marks, there's a percentage within that where you've got a fraction surviving as an earthwork. And in England, it's a bit more balanced, and as you can see from the map, again, it's dominated by our knowledge of upland areas in England. In terms of their distribution, this is a distribution of them, as I say, across Britain. You probably can't see it too well at the back, actually. It's one of the downsides of using light on dark. But then that brings me on to what they actually look like. Now, this is one of the surviving examples, one of the best ones of Britain. This is Pennymuir in the Scottish borders, just very close to the border with England. And some of these camps, you've got ditches that can be up to 2 metres deep, and can be up to 5 metres wide. So again, back to my comment about they couldn't have necessarily destroyed these things and slighted them, because we've got too many good upstanding examples to suggest that they automatically did destroy. And in this instance, they reutilised part of the perimeter with a smaller camp on a later occasion. These are some other examples. This is a Rosford Garrig in Wales, Cawthorne in North Yorkshire, put in specially for peat. This is one of the sites in Angus, which is one of the ones that was recorded by Melville and planned by Roy that I mentioned earlier. And then this is one that you would barely see on the ground, but here's a trench, a drainage trench that was put through, and you can see the ditch. This is one of the little practice camps on Gethleygar Common in South Wales. The ditch very clearly coming through. But essentially what we are talking about is a rampart with a ditch outside it by and large, and in some instances an upcast mound on the other side of the ditch, which is what they threw out of the ditch. And although the classical authors refer to turf and things, when they have been excavated, yes, you quite often get turfs, but you quite often get whatever was at their disposal for them to be able to use to create the rampart material. And as I say, in terms of survival, many just survive now. It's the ditch. The rampart is gone. It's been ploughed out. This is, as I say, one of those 18th century ones planned as an earthwork, since now only visible as a crop mark. This is Inchtuthil, the fortress in Perthshire I mentioned earlier. That's the site of the fortress. And outside it are a series of camps, and there's a whole series of internal features across the whole plateau, which may have housed troops involved in the construction of the fortress. And I will come on to these internal features that you can see shortly. This is one of my favourite sites, the Rosfagarrig in Wales, and had this not been, and it's one of these things, it's obviously got remarkable survival because it's in the Brecon Beacons, and you can see with this one you've got a very clear ditch, but I hope you can see on this corner here, you can see almost a mound on either side of the ditch, and as I say, that's that upcast mound that they've put up round the corner. I just love this image, so I always have to show it when I'm not just talking about Scotland. In terms of what they may have looked like, we know that the soldiers carried sort of valley or stakes with them when they were on the march, and there's been suggestions of various forms of additional defence. This is a sort of a caltrops, almost giving a barbed wire effect, which has been one suggested interpretation of what they may have looked like in terms of additional defence. And here's another suggestion of what it may be. And to a certain extent, if they were like this, then actually all we really need to do is put a trench through a surviving, upstanding rampart of a particularly well-preserved camp. But they haven't necessarily been targeted for those sort of excavations. There's lots more research questions that we can start to ask. I particularly like this one, because as you arrive in the camp, there's your display board telling you which tent you're in, and there's your rubbish for all your bins you leave. Now, most camps are quite regular in shape. I'll show you a lot of rectangles and squares, or have shown you a lot of rectangles and squares. But actually, there are some examples which are much more potentially topographically aware, or aware of other features in the landscape that have curtailed their form. And so here are some examples of camps which are not typical in terms of their topography, and as I say, in terms of their morphology and their enclosure. And I think there's a boggy area explaining this one. There's a need to enclose a higher level of ground here. This is actually dictated, this is one of the ones in southern Wales, it's dictated to by the landscape there. This is one of the curious ones at Burns Walk, this possible siege, and this is Cawthorne, and if there are any questions on Cawthorne, Pete can answer them. But as I say, most of them are generally square or rectangular in form, similar layout in many ways in terms of the troop disposition within, we think probably to what Roman forts are like. But I'll move on now to gates, because gates in effect represent weak points in the circuit, so they're generally kept to a minimum whilst enabling the army to go about its business. And particularly also, obviously, when you've got a large number of soldiers inside a camp, to get access to water supply. Now, we tend to get different types of gates, and these are particular Roman ones that help us to understand a site as being Roman, particularly when we've only got a partial survival of the remains. So I'll quickly run through the different types of entrance that we get. This is Penrhos in Wales, where we've just got a simple gap there, so we don't know what kind of defensive protection was used. Very, very common are these tituli, which are additional traverse, which in effect avoid a direct attack on a gate by forcing the attackers to go round and sideways. So it's this additional defensive protection on these gates here, which usually consist of a bank, a rampart with a ditch outside it. And here's another example. And sometimes if you've got, depending on the topography and how you're actually fitting the troops within the camp, you might get a change of alignment because of the way that they did the camp layout. And normally those alignments then are focused on the gate entrances. So you quite often get features like this. This is just across the water from Perth in Scotland. Again, very nice definition of a titulus there. And one of my favourite, even though one of the most bizarre camps in Scotland, where hopefully you can see here, you've got a titulus there, you've got one of these ditches outside, but this continues unbroken. So it's quite possible that this has been used twice, and in one time it was used as an entrance, and another time they actually just dug the ditch straight through. So that might give an indication this hasn't been excavated, of a site that's had multiple uses. And as for this four out here, whether it's, all right lads, you've got it wrong, go back and do another one, or quite whether there's, bloody-mindedness, practicing gates, not entirely sure. Somebody sort of thought, in 2,000 years' time that's going to look particularly pretty from the air. I doubt that last interpretation. But then also, my personal favourite, probably because there's not very many of them in Scotland, are these claviculae, which are very, very exciting when you find them. And particularly as upstanding feature, this is Escaperda on the Brecon Beacons in South Wales. And this is where you get an upstanding rampart, not always accompanied by a ditch. In fact, that's less common than common, but you have this turning rampart. And the purpose of that is, as you're going into the camp, you're actually forced, in effect, to expose your unshielded side. So again, it's an additional defensive feature. Sorry, that's that one there. And this is one of my favourite ones, Brithu in Tomlemere in North Wales, which I mentioned earlier. You can't actually sort of get a tent in the middle of it, but you see the scale of the bank here, which is now being spread. But essentially, this practicing of this internal curved rampart. And wonderfully, in terms of dating, there is an example on Trajan's column. And Trajan's campaigns in the early 2nd century, and we generally, I'll come back to dating, but we generally use these to assume that they're 1st century in date in a British example. And then very rarely we get ones where we have internal and external claviculae or cuspate entrances. This is Troutbeck in Cumbria, and these really are quite rare across Britain. And then a peculiarity that's only thus far recorded in Scotland are known as the stracathro type, where you actually, this is actually Dalgan Ross, where they were first recorded by Roy, but they were first recognised by St Joseph in the 1940s at Stracathro in Angus, which is why they called that, where you actually get an external clavicular ditch coming out and this oblique traverse, just providing this additional entrance protection. And they have quite a sporadic distribution. This is where they're recorded across Scotland, and the camps aren't of the same size. So it's possible that actually there may have been a particular camp prefect that liked using this, and actually we can start to trace his movements, therefore indicating much more flexibility in the Roman army than we perhaps had always been interpreting. And a few years ago, we actually found an upstanding example of these at Ravenfoot. So that's a Roman fort just going out of picture at Ravenfoot in Dumfriesshire. This is the part of Scotland that has more rainfall than anywhere else in Scotland, although whenever I've been there it's been blue skies, so I'm obviously a lucky charm when it comes to this site. But there's a Neolithic bank barrow running down the middle, which was surveyed by some of my colleagues some years ago, and we took great delight in pointing out they missed the Roman camp sat on top, which is coming round here. And it was only when somebody said, I think there's more going on here than just a bank barrow. So we had a look at the air photographs and we went to visit it in the field. There's the bank barrow. And we then did a plan of it. In fairness, it's quite mashed. There's a lot of rainfall. The rampart's gone, and what you've actually got a ditch, and then the upcast rubbish thrown out of the ditch on the other side. So it's almost a ditch with a bank outside it, which you wouldn't interpret as Roman. But actually, in the process of planning the Neolithic structure, they did actually plan half of a Stracathro gateway without realising it. I had so much fun with my prehistoric colleagues on that one. And here you've got, as I say, there's it coming through, and here you can very clearly see cutting through the earlier bank barrow, this ditch of the Stracathro gate. This is actually the best surviving one. In order to produce the digital terrain models, we've had to exaggerate it by time 3. It's a very mashed site. It's not very, very well preserved. As I say, always blue skies whenever I go there. And that's that gate, to give you an example of a clavicula. So we were very excited that we'd actually finally been able to get an upstanding example of a gateway. In terms of, before I leave gates, in terms of entrance protection, I thought I'd give an example of this one from S Bank in Dalkeith, not far from Edinburgh, where actually excavations produced one of these sort of ditched features, which was suggested to be possibly an additional defensive feature across the gateway, or a drain. And a suggestion it would have been another one of these sort of almost what's been referred to as an ericus or hedgehog, a kind of a defensive feature running across the gateway there. Not enough gateways have been excavated for us to actually know how frequent and how common this was as a feature. In terms of gate types known across Britain, as you can see, the vast majority are protected by a titulus, these additional bit of rampart and ditch, and these are the types. Then this is a breakdown, particularly of the clavicular types. But this actually gives you just an example. And as you can see, there's quite a number which are unknown or gap only. The gap only are usually crop mark sites, and they may well have had upstanding rampart internal claviculae, which have obviously been destroyed through ploughing. Another strange feature that we get more commonly on camps in Scotland than anywhere else are these additional attached camps or annexes, a particular feature of camps of 63 acres in Scotland. But moving on, sort of before leaving the defences, we also get camps with internal features. I hope you can see Eye of Faith, rows upon rows of pits in here. And when we planned these pits out, I then converted the measurements to Roman feet, and they matched exactly what one of the classical authors said was what you would have for two cohorts camped back to back. So we can start to use some of this evidence to start to have estimations of the layouts and the numbers of soldiers that were involved inside these camps. And I showed you Inch-Tooth earlier, and here you've got all these wonderful pits. Some of these have been excavated, they're pits. We think some of these may be ovens, but Kintor has demonstrated that you can get ovens throughout the camp. So we are dealing with potentially a range of rubbish pits and ovens in some of these features. This is one at Glenlocher, where I hope you can see lots of splodges inside the camp. Again, nothing's been excavated. This is a stracathro-gated camp down in Dalswinton in Dumfries and Galloway, where we were fortunate to do some large-scale geophysics, which not only produced the west side of the camp, but also a series of highly magnetic features suggestive of ovens inside, plus a whole scattering of what are probably ovens throughout the camp. Nothing was really visible of these things from the air, but on the using other surveying techniques. So it's quite possible that Roman camps actually could provide much more of a wealth of information if we just dug more of them. But as I say, they're big. They'd be very resource intensive, and actually geophysical survey is one of our mechanisms for going forward. And here's another wonderful example that was remapped some years ago by what was English Heritage, now Historic England, of Moss Side in Cumbria, where again you've got wonderful rows of these internal features leading in and out of gateways. And we can start to then use this to start estimating troop numbers inside camps. Now, in terms of what does it all mean, and how does all this information aid our understanding? Well, as I've mentioned, I mean, there have been lots of little small trenches through camps, but not necessarily anything that's given us dating evidence, because if the army's only occupying it for a short period of time, they're not necessarily leaving a huge amount of rubbish, which we can then pick up and then use to date. So this is what we use. It's historical context. We think there might be a probability. So again, we use, for Scotland, we use our knowledge of campaign periods in Scotland, associations with other dated sites. When we've got ground survey and excavation, quite often that at least establishes sequences between sites, and if we're really lucky, stratified artefacts and radiocarbon dates, although that's few and far between. Now, to give a historical context for where we actually try and fit these, I'm not going to read through all of this, but obviously we've got the first century invasions of Britain, well, the Julius Caesar ones, we've got the Claudian invasion and the occupation, conquest of North Britain into Wales, and then into Scotland, dropping back down ultimately to the line of Hadrian's Wall, then the conquest into Scotland leading to the construction of the Antonine Wall, retreat back south, and then further conquest by Septimius Severus and Sons in the early 3rd century. And then we've got these wonderful other tantalising references in the literature, but nothing that we can actually firmly tie down archaeological evidence to. But again, it may be that we're seeing the archaeology, we're just not interpreting it in the right manner. Now, what we, in terms of actually trying to group sites, we can't, you can't really group that many of them until you get really north of the Antonine Wall, when we start getting sequences of camps which look the same, which are a day's march apart, which are the same size. And we had a bash at this when I worked in Wales, and we kind of got a small grouping coming in from England and another potential pairing of sites over there. But again, nothing that really we could actually sort of start to say, okay, where's an army on a march? But I mean, that's not a massively surprising route for an army on the march into Wales. In northern England, there have been suggestion of the ones running along the A66 that have multiple gateways, similar size, again, day's march, potentially representing the same campaign, and there's been speculation as to the dates of when that might be. But it's when we start getting up into, sorry, there's the multiple gateways there, when we start getting into Scotland, that actually St Joseph really had had a lot of fun playing around with the camps and splitting them into groups, and a lot of what he's done has stood the test of time. But in terms of how we then use all this to date, well, I've mentioned before that clavicular gateways, we think in Britain, are only really something that came about in the 1st century. So that's all the camps with claviculae recorded across Britain. And I was quite confident of this until I heard a presentation by colleagues from the Czech Republic in September, where they've got something which looks like it might be a clavicula on a camp that's late 2nd century in date. So I'm waiting for them to come out with the final evidence of that before we actually say, well, maybe we need to start reappraising the evidence that we've got in Britain and the interpretation that we're using for this. The stracathro gateways, this is stracathro itself. It intersects with the annex of the fort, but on the assumption that it may well be earlier than the fort, then that's one of the reasons, because we don't know why it would intersect with an annex that was already there, if you see what I mean. So, and why not just shift it slightly so it avoided an existing earthwork feature. So that's slightly clutching at straws, but that's one of the reasons why we think that might be 1st century. Again, as I say, it's a stracathro camp, so it's got the claviculae. Kintore, I've mentioned, up here, produced a whole raft of 1st century dates. It's a day's march from this camp, a day's march from that camp. So we can start to say, okay, we've got these huge 110-acre camps in northern Scotland. They've all similar rectangular layouts, 6 gates, all protected by tituli, very similar. Potentially all a day's march from each other. One of them's 1st century in date, the others potentially all belong in the same campaign. So we start to use the kind of inference to start to date these things. And then plotting that on a map, these are the sites where either something's been found that dates it or by association or something. So that's kind of what we would say, okay, I think these camps are Flavian. But then when you then plot that against the distribution of forts, you can see that we've clearly got large gap areas. There's no surprising, obviously, that campaigns went beyond the actual construction of permanent bases, but there's huge gap areas in the west and southwest Scotland where we must be either missing camps, or we are certainly missing camps, but also not seeing sites as necessarily being 1st century in date. I can't leave the 1st century without mentioning Mons Graupius. It's not been found. I live in hope it'll be found in my lifetime. They keep finding lots of wonderful battles on the continent, but they're generally battles that the Romans lost, not the Romans won. Metal detecting may yet be our saviour in this. And these are the number of sites that it's been claimed at in Scotland. And in fact, some people would start putting crosses way up here. I'm not really going to speculate. I did give a lecture in Aberdeen a few years ago. Oh, I've taken that slide off, unfortunately, where I showed a picture of the hill at Benachie, and of course the Aberdonians want it to be there. There's a very, very large camp next there, and it's as good example as anywhere, but I'm not prepared to stick my neck out and say which one. Somebody from the BBC contacted me a year or two back saying we want to do a new programme, and as part of the programme we want to find Mons Graupius. So good luck with that. Needless to say, I never heard any more about that, so I don't think that got off the ground. Going into the 2nd century, I've mentioned these sites, the camps along the Antonine Wall, which we're quite confident as being 2nd century in date. This is a site in southwest Scotland at Kirkpatrick Fleming, which has produced Hadrianic pottery. So we think in a Scottish context, or late Hadrianic pottery in a Scottish context, that's possibly indicating an Antonine phase of conquest. We've got pottery from these sites here. This one here that suggested an Antonine date. Interestingly, that's an Antonine fort. That's a Flavian 1st century fort, 2nd century fort, 1st century fort. The line water running between. So it's quite possible that actually we can say, well, actually, can we start saying that on this side of the river they were camping in the 2nd century, on this side of the river they were camping in the 1st century? As you can see, I am slightly clutching at straws here. I like this site because it's 6 miles from my house. And then this one, which is a site in Dunning in Perthshire, one of the claimed sites of Mons Graupius, which has produced 2nd century pottery from the fill of this ditch. But it's a day's march apart from another site which has produced 1st century pottery. It's the same size, the same shape, but as you can see, this one looks like it may have had a different phase of use. Plus, there was evidence for recutting, so it may well be that although we've got 2nd century pottery from this site, it may also have been occupied in the 1st century. So even getting a piece of dating evidence doesn't give you the total date for that site, it just gives you the date for its occupation at one phase in its use. Here we've got a stracathro-gated camp here, but there's been analysis of the fluvial channels, paleo channels over here, which suggested that this terrace couldn't have been formed till the 2nd century. So anything over here must be 1st century, reinforcing that stracathro, the date of the stracathro camps as being 1st century in date. There's the gateway there. And that's a plan of it. So it's a suggestion that all the sites over here could be 2nd century or later in date. So, and as I say, that's using environmental evidence. And a day's march from that, we've got these sites here, which if they encompass the area that we think they might be a similar size. And then we've got another couple of sites in Perthshire now, that was in Dumfriesshire, where an excavation took place just here, where the Roman road intersected this 63-acre camp, which was thought to be 3rd century in date, where actually the excavation demonstrated that the camp was earlier than the road, and the latest that the road can be is 2nd century in date, therefore suggesting that the camp may be early 2nd century and part of an early phase of Antonine incursion into Scotland. We've also got Ardogh, the Roman fort of Ardogh, which has got a plethora of camps overlapping each other. These haven't produced very much dating, but what we have got is sequences between them. This large camp here, 130 acres in size, sits on top of a 1st century watchtower. It is later than this site here, It is also later than the annex to the fort. We don't know the date of the annex to the fort, but it might be 2nd century. So we're starting to say, okay, this could be 3rd century in date. It's also huge. I'll come back to that very shortly. So those camps that I was saying that were excavated, where we're starting to say these 63-acre camps thought of as 3rd century might be 2nd century in date, they're the ones that have also got annexes outside them. They run in this wonderful ellipse, days march potentially marching distance apart, up and back. And if we start saying those are 2nd century in date, well, that's the knowledge of our 2nd century camps, as you say, dominated by the Antonine Wall. But are we suggesting actually potentially that the army was campaigning right the way up here, even though that was the area that it occupied? Moving into 3rd century now, this is the fortress of Carpou on the south side of the Tay. And I've already mentioned this large camp here, which we think might be 3rd century in date. So we're now starting to suggest this could relate to the campaigns of Septimius Severus and his sons. And we've got a lovely series of these huge camps running up through Scotland. We know that he reached the ends of the earth. We don't know what the ends of the earth is, but he did at least get sight of the sea by the time he got up here. So depending on how you interpret the classical sources, he may not necessarily have got further than this, because in the winter of 2010-2011, he wintered back in York and died in February. 211. I've just given them an extra few centuries of life. But he died in that, and it's well known that I think why conquer Scotland when you've got Rome, basically. So they didn't really. His sons abandoned his conquest in effect and moved south. We've also got a token one of these down here, which then hooks up with a larger series of camps, which runs through southwest. Now I showed you earlier that very, very large camp of St Leonard's in the Borders. To show you it in its entirety, I'd have to show you about 11 or so slides. So there's a plan of it. As I say, it's all a crop mark field now, but it's 170 acres in size. It's massive, and the only logical explanation for this at the moment is that we know Septimius Severus himself came into Scotland, and if you think that he travelled with all the people he needed to run the Roman Empire, his Praetorian Guard, and all the accompaniments around that, that is the best explanation for why we've got such an enormous camp sitting up here. And it's one of a suite of 4 camps. Another one is at Newstead. There's the Roman fort of Newstead Trimontium on the Tweed. A small amount of it has been excavated and suggested that it's the latest feature on this site. That's Newstead, another one of these huge camps running down here. So we think we may have a suite of 4 camps, so this is a map with other ones as well, that are, again, a day's march apart, that may have actually housed Septimius Severus. So although, again, no actual dating evidence, the inference that we're using is relatively strong. So this brings me on, you can please note, to my last slide. So hopefully, I wanted to finish off, I've shown you a lot of empty fields, and I wanted to finish off with actually a wonderful exhibition I was fortunate enough to see in September. Somebody has collected an awful lot of Roman soldiers, and they've turned them in. These wonderful things, but just to give you an example of moving from, this is a baggage train, and an idea of what it might have looked like to move an army of the scales that we're talking about. I haven't talked about army numbers in this talk, But there's a suggestion that the army of Agricola in the 1st century may have had perhaps 21,000 men with him, to give you an idea of scale. When we're moving into the 3rd century, suggestions have been made of up to 40,000 soldiers in some of these sites. So the logistics and the vast of that are really quite something exceptional. And as I've mentioned, we've got they cluster, and we've got these large ones days march apart in northern Britain, particularly north of the Antonine Wall, and 50% of sites north of the Antonine Wall can be grouped into one of these series, whereas it's less than 10% anywhere else in Britain. And the other thing, just to finish off with, is to say that actually there are now, north of Hadrian's Wall, there are over 100 camps now known, which are in excess of 10 hectares in size. So I suppose I'll finish off with size does matter. Thank you.